The town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet one, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Life was slow, peaceful, and seemingly uneventful. But like every quiet town, it carried its share of secrets. No one could have ever predicted that on a crisp autumn morning, the mournful bark of a dog would unravel a story so tragic, so heart-wrenching. It would forever change the fabric of the town's existence. For years, the people of Willow Creek had whispered about the mysterious death of Clara Montgomery. A beloved schoolteacher and friend, Clara's passing had been the subject of hushed conversations and dark speculations. Her funeral was held in silence, with only a handful of people present. But one person, a small but devoted dog named Max, had never let go of his owner. He waited at the edge of her grave every day, his mournful bark filling the air as if begging for answers. And then, one day, Rocky did something that nobody could have expected. He led a group of villagers to the graveyard, his tail wagging and nose sniffing fervently around Clara's resting place. It was his bark that would lead them to something so disturbing it would shatter everything they thought they knew about Clara's death. When the villagers, drawn by Rocky's persistent barking, opened the coffin, what they found inside would leave them breathless, and the answers they sought would haunt them forever. It had been 2 years since Clara Montgomery's death, and life in Willow Creek had, for the most part, carried on without her. The small, sleepy town had a rhythm that was familiar and unchanging, its people wrapped in routines that gave comfort. The bakery continued to churn out warm loaves every morning, the children went to school in the same old yellow buses, and the leaves of the oak trees rustled with the soft sighs of autumn. But not everything had moved on. Rocky, Clara's small, wiry terrier, could never quite let go. Every morning at dawn, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the town, Rocky would slip out of his little house in the corner of the yard and bound across the dirt road that led to the cemetery. His legs were small, but his pace was steady and determined. It was as if, in the quiet of the early hours, he could still feel the pull of Clara's presence, still smell the faint scent of her perfume on the air, still hear her laughter echoing faintly in the distance. The townspeople would see him as he passed by, walking toward the hill where Clara's grave lay nestled among the others. He would stop there each day, his paws planted firmly in the soft earth, and stare down at the grave. Then, after a long pause, he would begin to bark. His voice was a high, sharp yelp, full of anguish and loss, and the sound would ripple through the cemetery like a sad, lonely echo. At first, people dismissed it. Dogs grieve, they told themselves. Rocky was just mourning the loss of his beloved owner, the woman who had taken care of him for so many years. Clara had been kind-hearted, the type of person who never turned away anyone in need, who had poured love into everything she did. And Rocky, with his small brown eyes and bushy tail, had been her constant companion. After her sudden and unexpected death, it made sense that the dog would mourn. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Rocky's behavior became more than just sorrow. It became an obsession. His daily pilgrimage to Clara's grave never wavered, and the barking grew louder, more desperate, and more frequent. Some of the townspeople, those who had once found it sweet, began to avoid the cemetery. The sound of Rocky's barking had started to take on a new tone, something raw and unrelenting. It was as if the dog was trying to communicate, trying to tell them something that no one could understand. Sarah Hastings, who had been Clara's best friend, was one of the few who remained unfazed by Rocky's daily ritual. She had known Clara longer than anyone in town and had been with her through everything, through the joyful moments and the painful ones. Sarah had helped Clara through her battles, her quiet fears, her dreams, and her hopes. But she also knew Clara's secret, the one that she had never shared with anyone, not even Rocky. Clara had lived with a shadow, a fear that had loomed over her, something so deep and dark that she had never spoken of it, even to her closest friend. It was as if Clara had carried a burden that had weighed heavily on her heart until it became too much. Sarah would visit the cemetery occasionally, and each time she would find Rocky standing there, as though he were guarding the grave. She would walk over and sit beside him, the silence thick between them, knowing that there were questions left unanswered. Why had Clara died so suddenly? What had happened to her in those final days? The coroner had ruled her death as a heart attack, a sudden and unexpected event that no one had seen coming, But Sarah had never been satisfied with that explanation. Clara had been young, full of life, and the idea of her dying so suddenly, so tragically, seemed wrong. That fateful morning, however, something in the air felt different. Rocky had been barking for hours, his yelps sharp and piercing. It wasn't the usual sorrowful cry. There was an urgency in his voice, a frantic energy that sent chills down Sarah's spine. She had arrived early, hoping to find some peace by Clara's grave, but when she stepped into the cemetery, she was immediately struck by the tension in the air. It wasn't the stillness that she had grown used to. It was as if something was wrong, something that had been buried long ago was stirring beneath the earth. Rocky didn't even acknowledge her approach. His eyes were wide, his tail rigid, and his barking had a frantic rhythm, as if he were caught in some sort of panic. The closer Sarah got to him, the more the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. This was not the grieving dog she had known. This was a dog in distress, as though he had uncovered something that wasn't meant to be found. "Rocky, stop," Sarah called out softly, stepping closer to the dog. But Rocky didn't stop. His barking grew louder, more insistent, and now, his eyes flicked toward her as if pleading for her to understand. Sarah's heart began to race. She had seen Rocky in grief before, but this was different. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she reached out to comfort him, but he pulled away, snapping at her gently as though telling her to stay back. "Rocky," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "What is it, boy?" It was then that she noticed the fresh marks on the earth near Clara's grave. The dirt was unsettled, as though someone had recently disturbed it. Sarah's breath hitched in her chest. She had been here only a few days ago, and everything had been undisturbed then. Why would the grave have been touched? Rocky's barking reached an almost unbearable pitch, and in that moment, Sarah understood. This was no ordinary grief. Rocky wasn't just mourning his lost owner. He was trying to tell her something that no one else had seen, something that had been hidden away beneath the surface. She didn't know why or how, but she knew what she had to do. She had to look deeper. Something about Clara's death, about the way she had died, was wrong. The unanswered questions, the buried secrets, the way Clara had disappeared from her life so suddenly, were all coming together now. It wasn't just Rocky who had felt it, it was Sarah too. And it was time to find out the truth. "Rocky," she said softly, her voice trembling as she stood up, "we're going to find out what really happened to Clara." Rocky's barking slowed, as though he had heard her promise. He turned his gaze toward her, his eyes wide with an unspoken understanding. For the first time in months, Rocky seemed to calm, his frantic energy giving way to a quiet intensity. And Sarah, with a heavy heart and a determination she hadn't felt in years, set her eyes on the grave before her. Something was hidden beneath it, and she would uncover it no matter the cost. The morning after Rocky's frantic barking, a handful of villagers gathered at the cemetery. Word had spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. The strange behavior of the dog, his incessant barking, and the fresh disturbance in the earth around Clara's grave had left many uneasy. There was something off, something beneath the surface that no one could quite explain. And so, curiosity, and a bit of unease, had led a few brave souls to the cemetery. Sarah Hastings was among them, her heart heavy with 1,000 unsaid words. She stood in the quiet group of villagers, feeling the cool autumn air press against her skin as she looked down at Rocky. The little terrier had always been a skittish thing, especially around strangers. But today he sat still, his small body planted firmly on the ground, his eyes locked on Clara's gravestone. It was as if Rocky, despite his usual restlessness, had somehow come to an understanding that these people were here for a reason. The villagers murmured among themselves, casting nervous glances at one another. No one knew what to do. The air around the grave felt thick, heavy with something unspoken, something waiting to be discovered. The trees, usually rustling softly with the wind, stood eerily still, their leaves frozen in time as if nature itself held its breath. Even the birds, usually chirping at the break of dawn, were silent. It was as if the entire world had paused, caught in a moment of tension and waiting. Sarah's gaze flickered from Rocky to Clara's grave. She had been there so many times, always with Clara beside her, the two of them chatting as they sat beneath the shade of the ancient oak. But now the place felt different. The gravestone, once a symbol of peaceful finality, seemed cold, a hollow reminder of a truth too painful to face. And yet, Sarah knew there was more to Clara's death than anyone had been told. She could feel it deep in her bones. The villagers around her were lost in their thoughts, some of them fidgeting uncomfortably, others speaking in low tones, but Sarah's mind was elsewhere. She could still see Clara's face, the way it had lit up whenever she smiled, the warmth of her presence. Clara had been a beacon of light in Willow Creek, a woman who had touched everyone's life with her kindness and compassion. To think that such a vibrant soul could be gone so suddenly had always seemed wrong. The coroner had said it was a heart attack, that it had come without warning, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to accept that explanation. Clara had been healthy, strong. The idea that her death had been simply an accident, a cruel twist of fate, didn't sit right with her. Sarah, a voice interrupted her thoughts and she turned to see Samuel Ford, the town's carpenter, standing beside her. His weathered face was set in a grim expression. "What do you think happened here?" he asked, his eyes flickering nervously toward Rocky, who had begun to pace now, his small body agitated. Sarah swallowed, her mouth dry. She hadn't shared her suspicions with anyone, not even Samuel, but today, something felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was just out of reach, buried beneath the surface of the earth, hidden in the very place they stood. "I don't know, Samuel," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But something's wrong. I can feel it." Rocky's barking suddenly grew louder, more insistent. His tail was stiff, and his small form darted around the gravestone as if trying to communicate something, his eyes darting between the villagers as though urging them to understand. The group grew uneasy. Several of them backed away slowly, unsure of how to handle the dog's behavior. It was one thing to hear a dog mourn for its owner, it was another entirely to witness this. It was as if Rocky were trying to warn them of something terrible, of something hidden beneath Clara's death. "I think we need to dig," Sarah said, her words coming out before she could stop them. It wasn't a decision she had thought through, but the words felt right. In her gut, she knew it was the only way forward. Clara's death had been too sudden, too unexplained, and the way Rocky was acting, it wasn't normal grief. It was something more. The villagers exchanged glances, most of them hesitant, but Sarah's resolve was unwavering. Clara had been her closest friend. She owed it to her to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Samuel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You know we can't just do that. It's illegal to disturb a grave." His voice was cautious, but there was a flicker of curiosity behind his eyes. He had known Clara well enough, and like many of the others, he found it hard to believe her death was as simple as it had been made out to be. "I know," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "But something's wrong. I don't care about the rules anymore. We owe it to Clara to find out what happened." Rocky's barking had turned into a whimper now, his small form wriggling in distress. He seemed to sense that the decision had been made. The urgency in his eyes was unmistakable, as though he had known this day would come. Sarah crouched down beside the dog, her hand reaching out to gently rest on his head. His fur was soft and warm, but his body was tense, as though he was both relieved and anxious at once. "We'll do it together, Rocky," she whispered, brushing her fingers through his fur. "We'll find the truth." The group of villagers, still unsure of what to make of the situation, slowly gathered around Sarah. Some offered quiet words of support, others stood back, unsure of how to proceed. But one by one they began to understand. Something had happened here, something that had been concealed for too long. And if they didn't act now, they might never uncover the truth. Sarah stood and looked around at the group, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that churned within her. "Let's open the grave." The decision was made. With their hands trembling, the villagers began to gather tools. Shovels, picks, and other instruments were pulled from the trunks of their cars, the weight of the task ahead settling in. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she looked down at Clara's grave, at the place where her friend had been laid to rest. She never thought she would have to do something like this, to disturb the final resting place of the person she had loved so dearly. But there was no turning back now. The dog barked once more, his voice a sharp cry in the cool morning air. And as the first shovelful of dirt was lifted from Clara's grave, a strange silence descended over the cemetery, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The decision to dig had come so suddenly, and yet, in some way, it felt inevitable. Every person in the group, even those who had been hesitant at first, now stood in silent agreement. They were all in this together. The unease that had weighed down on Sarah's chest grew heavier with every passing moment, and Rocky's persistent barking only confirmed what she had been afraid to admit. Something was wrong. The cemetery was eerily quiet now, save for the occasional sharp bark from Rocky, whose distress only seemed to increase as they prepared to disturb Clara's final resting place. The dog paced back and forth, his eyes wide, tail stiff as if urging the group to hurry. It was a strange sight, the little dog who had always been so timid, now acting with such unrelenting urgency. But no one spoke. There was no need for words anymore, the atmosphere said it all. As the group of villagers gathered their tools, a deep silence fell over them. A shovel was thrust into the earth with a soft, reluctant thud, followed by another and another. Each shovelful that lifted the dirt felt like a betrayal. The air was thick with tension, the task before them daunting and unnatural. The cemetery, which had once been a peaceful place of rest, now felt like a stage for something dark, a moment that would haunt them all. Rocky's barking grew sharper, more desperate, as if urging them on, but there was a growing sense of dread in the pit of Sarah's stomach. She looked down at the grave, at the earth that had once been undisturbed, and wondered if she was doing the right thing. Would they find what they expected? Or would the truth be something far worse than they could imagine? Every shovel that struck the earth seemed to answer that question. They had to know. They had no choice now. As the minutes dragged by, the group worked in uneasy silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic strike of shovels and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The sun, once high in the sky, had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long, haunting shadows over the cemetery. The deepening dusk added to the sense of anticipation that hung in the air, thick as the earth they were digging through. After what felt like hours, the shovel finally struck something solid. The unmistakable sound of metal against wood echoed through the cemetery, sending a ripple of shock through the group. They all stopped, breath caught in their throats, looking down at the newly unearthed coffin. The task was almost done. But as they stood there, staring down at the object that had once been Clara's final resting place, a wave of disbelief washed over them. This wasn't just an ordinary grave. This was the grave of a woman they had loved and known, a woman who had once been full of life, and yet there was something terribly wrong about this moment. Rocky, who had been circling restlessly, let out a low whine. His eyes were locked on the coffin now, his body still, almost as if he too was waiting. Sarah swallowed hard. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined she would be in this position. Never once had she imagined she would be here, standing in front of her best friend's grave, about to disturb the very earth that had claimed her. But there was no going back. "Are we sure about this?" Samuel's voice broke through the quiet. His face was pale, his eyes wide with unease. "This feels wrong." "I know," Sarah said quietly, her voice shaky but resolute. "But we have to. We have to know." The group stood around Clara's grave, now surrounded by a deep hole, the coffin resting just beneath the surface. The air felt impossibly heavy. Sarah was aware of the others' nervous glances, the unspoken fear in their eyes. They could all feel it. This moment was pivotal. It would change everything. Taking a deep breath, Sarah knelt beside the coffin. Her hands trembled as she reached for the rough wood of the lid. There was a creak, a groan of the old wood as she pried it open, the sound too loud in the stillness of the graveyard. Her fingers brushed against the cool surface of the coffin's lid, and her breath hitched in her throat. What would she find inside? What could she possibly find that would explain Rocky's unrelenting barking, the deep fear that had settled in her heart? With one final, trembling motion, Sarah lifted the coffin lid, the wood scraping against the sides with a groan of protest. The world around her seemed to hold its breath as the lid opened fully. Her heart raced in her chest, every nerve on edge, and for a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own breathing, ragged and shallow. And then she looked inside. The sight that met her eyes was not what she had expected. Not by a long shot. Clara's body was not there. The inside of the coffin was empty. Sarah's pulse quickened as she stumbled back, a cry of shock escaping her lips. Her hands gripped the sides of the coffin, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. The coffin was lined with soft fabric, undisturbed, its contents missing. There were no flowers, no signs of decay, no trace of Clara at all. The villagers gasped, stepping forward cautiously, unable to comprehend what was before them. There was silence for a moment, a thick, heavy silence that hung over them all like a fog. Then one by one they began to speak, their voices rising in panic. "This isn't right. Where is she? Clara's gone, but how?" Sarah stood there, her body trembling as she reached into the coffin, touching the fabric that lined its interior. It felt cold, smooth. Too smooth. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, all trying to latch onto some shred of understanding. Had someone removed Clara's body? So what? And if Clara wasn't buried here, where was she? Rocky, who had been sitting so still, now jumped forward, his tiny body shaking with agitation. He barked once, sharply, and then whined again, louder and more urgent this time. His eyes were wide, his small chest heaving as he looked into the empty coffin. It was as though he, too, understood the magnitude of what they had just uncovered. "Clara isn't here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The words were a stark truth ringing in her ears. She turned to the group, her face pale with shock. She wasn't buried here at all. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble with an unknown force, and the air, already thick with the weight of anticipation, now felt suffocating. The puzzle was only beginning to unfold, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. Clara's death had never been an accident. And whatever had happened, whatever truth had been hidden beneath the earth, would change their lives forever. The answers were waiting, but they were buried deeper than any of them had imagined. The air around the group seemed to grow colder as Sarah's trembling hands fumbled over the folded blanket in the coffin. It was unexpected. The coffin had been empty, but not in the way they thought. There was no body, but there was something strange, something that didn't belong. With a mixture of disbelief and curiosity, Sarah gently lifted the blanket, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric. It was neatly folded, almost too neatly, as if it had been placed there deliberately, with a sense of care and order that felt wrong in the context of everything else. Underneath the blanket, tucked into the folds, was a small piece of paper, a letter. The moment Sarah's eyes fell on it, a chill crept down her spine. The paper was old, yellowed with age, but the handwriting on it was unmistakable. It was Clara's handwriting. Her heart raced in her chest as she unfolded the letter slowly, every motion feeling like it was happening in slow motion. The words on the page were clear, but they didn't make sense. They were not what anyone had expected, certainly not what Sarah had imagined Clara might leave behind. Rocky, who had been pacing nervously, let out a low whine. His small body seemed to sag with the weight of whatever this letter contained, and Sarah knew that whatever the truth was, it wasn't something they were ready for. Sarah's voice cracked as she began to read the letter aloud, her hands trembling so violently that it took her several moments to steady herself enough to get the words out. To my dearest friends, if you are reading this, then it means my worst fear has come to pass. I hope with all my heart that you will never have to understand the pain I'm feeling as I write these words. But if there is one thing I know, it is that the truth must come out, even if it is too late for me to explain it to you in person. I have made the hardest decision of my life. I am writing this because I can no longer bear the weight of the secret I have kept from all of you, the people who loved me, who trusted me. For so long, I believed that I could keep it hidden, that I could protect myself and those around me from the man I once thought I loved. But I was wrong. He has become someone unrecognizable to me, someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. I'm not dead. Not really. The life you think I've left behind is nothing more than a lie, a carefully constructed lie born out of desperation. I have faked my death in order to escape him. I had no choice. He was dangerous, and I could see the darkness inside him growing with every passing day. He became obsessed with me, with controlling me, with keeping me by his side at all costs. I fought, oh how I fought, to break free, but in the end I knew I had to disappear. I had to leave everything behind to keep myself safe. Please do not think that I abandoned you willingly. The decision to fake my death was not one I made lightly. It tore me apart to leave behind the people I loved, to leave behind Rocky, to leave behind you all. But I had no other option. He would never have stopped until he found me. I couldn't live in fear anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid for my life and the lives of everyone I cared about. So I disappeared, and I thought that would be enough. But now, as I sit here in hiding, I realize that I will never be free of this. I cannot change what I've done, and I cannot ask for forgiveness for the pain I've caused. But please know that it was the only way I could survive. I did what I had to do, and I pray you will one day understand. I never wanted this for anyone, and I can only hope that you will be able to forgive me. I love you all, and I will forever carry your love in my heart. Yours always, Claire. Sarah's voice faltered as she finished reading the letter, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The silence that followed was suffocating. The weight of Clara's words hung in the air like a cloud, pressing down on them, thick and suffocating. For a long moment no one spoke. The villagers exchanged glances, their faces pale with shock, disbelief, and confusion. They had thought Clara had died of natural causes, that her heart had simply given out in the middle of the night. But now the truth that Clara had been hiding for years, had been laid bare before them, and it was more horrifying than they could have ever imagined. Clara had faked her death to escape an abusive, violent man. The man she had once loved had turned into a monster, and in order to protect herself, she had made the unimaginable decision to disappear from her life. To everyone who had loved her, to her friends, her family, she had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions. It was a moment of truth, but it was a moment that brought with it more questions than answers. Who was he? Samuel finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Who was the man she was running from? The question hung in the air, unanswered. No one knew. Clara had kept that part of her life locked away, hidden from even her closest friends. But now it seemed that the truth was more dangerous than they could have imagined. The man who had driven Clara to such extremes, the one who had pushed her into hiding, was still out there somewhere. And if he had discovered the truth, if he knew Clara was alive, what would he do? Rocky barked suddenly, his small body rigid with fear, and Sarah looked down at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The dog seemed to understand far more than they did. He had been there with Clara. He had known the truth. And now he was reacting to something that none of them could see but all of them could feel. Sarah turned to the group, her voice shaking. We need to find him. We need to find the man she was running from. Because if Clara was right, if he knew she was alive, then we're all in danger. The realization hit them all at once. The danger wasn't over. The man Clara had feared for so long was still out there. And if he had been watching, if he knew they had uncovered the truth, then they were all in grave danger. They had uncovered Clara's darkest secret, but in doing so, they had opened a door that could never be closed again. And now they were all at risk. The sky had darkened completely by the time the villagers had replaced the coffin in the earth. The soft glow of lanterns flickered in the cemetery, casting long shadows over the gravestones. They had done what they could, they had learned the truth. But the weight of that truth had seeped deep into their bones, settling in a way that none of them were ready for. Rocky stood by the grave once more, his little body rigid with the same tension that had never left him. His tail was still, but his eyes were wide as if watching the world shift before him, his gaze flickering back to the freshly filled grave that had held Clara's secret for so long. The villagers watched from a distance, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to say. The evening air was thick with grief, and the cool breeze stirred the fallen leaves at their feet, as if the world itself was mourning. Clara had been gone for 2 years, but the town of Willow Creek had only just begun to understand the depth of her absence, a depth that was far darker than anyone had ever imagined. The last few hours had turned the town on its head. The revelation that Clara's death had been faked to escape an abusive lover was a blow they had not seen coming. It was a betrayal, but not in the way they had feared. She hadn't abandoned them. She hadn't left them behind. She had faked her own death to protect herself, to survive. And they, the people who had loved her, had never known. They had lived on, believing her death was an unfortunate accident, never suspecting the terror she had been running from. Now, standing by the grave, Sarah could see the truth in Rocky's eyes. The little terrier had known all along. He had waited by this grave for 2 years, not hoping that Clara would return, but waiting for the moment when her secret would be revealed. He had been the only one who understood, who had never stopped believing that Clara's death wasn't an end, it was just a beginning, a desperate act of survival. Sarah knelt down next to Rocky, her hand brushing against his soft fur. He didn't look up at her, his focus entirely on the grave. His bark had softened over the hours, and now it was just a faint, mournful cry that echoed in the distance. It was as though he had been waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. And now that it had, he seemed to understand that there was nothing more to be done. "Rocky," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "She's gone, but she's not lost. She's been running, hiding for so long, and now we know why." She sighed, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her chest. She was never really gone. She was just waiting for us to understand. Rocky's bark was quieter now, softer, almost as if in agreement. His tail gave a slow, gentle wag, but there was no joy in it. Only sorrow. The villagers began to gather around, the weight of the truth settling over them like an unspoken understanding. They had all known Clara, loved her, but they had never known this side of her. They had never understood the pain she had carried with her, the terror that had lived just beneath the surface of the woman they had all thought they knew so well. She had kept her secret from everyone, even her closest friends. She had carried it alone until the end. As Sarah stood, wiping a tear from her cheek, she realized that their town would never be the same. The illusion of peace that had hung over Willow Creek for so long had been shattered, and in its place was a deeper, more painful truth. Sometimes the ones we lose aren't truly gone. They're just hiding from a world that couldn't protect them. Rocky's bark, though quiet, resonated through the night air. It was a sorrowful cry, the kind of bark that seemed to carry all the pain Clara had never been able to voice. She had loved her life in Willow Creek. She had loved the people here. But she had been forced to leave it all behind in a desperate attempt to save herself. The villagers watched in silence, knowing that Rocky's sorrow was deeper than their own. He had witnessed everything from Clara's pain to her desperate decision to disappear. He had waited by the grave because he had never given up on her, never stopped believing that somehow, some way the truth would come out. And now that it had, there was nothing left to do but to mourn her loss in a new, painful way, the way only those who have loved and lost can. In the quiet of the graveyard, as the villagers stood in solemn silence, the night seemed to stretch on forever. Rocky's mournful bark echoed one final time before it faded into the cold night air. It was the final goodbye, the end of a chapter, and yet, the beginning of a new understanding. Willow Creek would remember Clara. They would never forget the woman who had been forced into hiding, the woman who had faked her death to escape the hands of a man who had once held her heart. They would remember the life she had lived, and the life she had been forced to leave behind. And for the first time they would understand the truth. The ones we lose, sometimes, are not lost forever. They're just waiting. Waiting for the world to understand the pain they have lived with, waiting for the truth to set them free. Rocky's bark had been a symbol of loyalty, of love, and of the deepest sorrow, but it was also a reminder that sometimes the ones we love are not gone. They are only hidden, waiting for the truth to come to light. And in the quiet of the cemetery, under the stars that twinkled above, the villagers of Willow Creek finally understood. The truth had been revealed, and with it, a new chapter had begun. But Clara's story, her life, her struggle, her courage, would never be forgotten. And neither would Rocky's final, mournful bark.